Hello, I'm Dave Reilly. In this segment we're going to continue the fabrication of the molding plane. We're going to do the metalworking now, and fitting and heat treating and tempering the steel and the final tune-up of the plane. Now we turn our attention to making the plane iron. This is going to be the shape that you're going to deal with. The way it fits into this slot here, into the throat, and then the wedge is what holds it in place. So the first step is to cut the material. Now the material we're going to use is oil hardening tool steel. Now it sounds very formidable, but it's very soft. It's very easy to work with a hacksaw, with a file. You don't need any power machinery to do any work on this. When you mark it out, I use a machinist's marking fluid. Paint it, and then it shows my scribed line. If you don't have this, a blue permanent marker will work just as fine, just as long as you can see your line that you have to cut to. And then just cut it out using a hacksaw. It's very straightforward. You can obtain this at any good industrial supply store, Enco, J&L, or McMaster Carr. They all carry this type of steel. For this we're using a 3/4 inch by 1/8 inch thick oil hardening tool steel. Now if you notice, almost all hacksaws that you can rotate the blade so that I can cut this way. Otherwise, if it were still straight, I would not have the depth that I should have. You can see how I wouldn't be far enough down. So these are all, you can turn the blade any direction you need. And that's all it takes. Now just with a little dressing up with a file, and then we can just finish dressing this up with a file. Take off any sharp corners so that your hands don't catch on it. And this is as much cosmetics as it is anything else. The iron is in. Now it's just a matter of tightening it up and then scribing the outline of the curve. Now, in case you thought you could make it a little easier, this is not a semicircle. As you can see, we're cutting across a circle and we're forming an ellipse. This is why you have to lay it out. You can't just scribe a circle and grind to that point. Next thing to do is simply to grind the radius that we need. Now this is our scribed outline that we're going to grind down to. For the initial grinding, we can grind it just at a right angle. It's easier to grind up to the profile that way. The second step will be to grind the clearance angle before we do the hardening and tempering. Once you have completed the grinding of the profile, adjust your tool rest so that you can get a 45-degree angle, clearance angle here on the tool. When you grind back the clearance angle, don't go right up to the edge. As you can see, I have about a 32nd or a little less flat area on the front edge. Leave that there before you do the heat treatment. If you grind it too thin, you'll burn that edge away during the heat treatment. This will be ground away later when we do the final grinding. Before we start the heat treatment, there's a few safety precautions that we have to follow. First of all, it's very important to keep your whole work area clean. Get all the wood shavings and sawdust off the bench and off the floor, so there's no chance of you starting a fire here. I cover the bench with a piece of metal just as a precaution. I wear a pair of gloves on the hand that I'm handling the hot metal with. These fire bricks, I make this little enclosure. It simply holds the heat in, and it makes the heating a little quicker and a little easier to control. If you don't have these, you can do the heat treating just in free air. It just takes a bit longer to bring up the heat. Of course, we have a fire extinguisher over here. That's very important to have. And then the rest is just to go ahead and do the job. Over here, we do have the quenching oil. I use olive oil. It has a higher flash point than the motor oil. Also, hot motor oil gives off some very bad fumes, and I would not recommend you using it. The olive oil works very well. Besides, it smells awfully good when you use it. It's very useful to have an assistant ready if you can. It might be nice to have an extra hand. The heat source I'm using is a MAP gas hardware item blowtorch. And I use it at full heat. You can see how the fire bricks are containing the heat. It just makes the process a bit faster. When it's time to pick this up to do the quenching, I'm going to use a pair of vice grip pliers. That way they clamp tight and there's no chance of me losing the iron before I get it into the quenching oil. You can see now that I'm up to a good red heat. It's just the tip that you have to do. You don't have to do the whole iron. Now I'm getting a nice uniform red heat. And now it's time to go into the oil. You just quickly drop it in and stir it around. And that's all it takes. Now your test for hardness is just to try a file on it. Now you can hear it's very hard. Here's the soft end. You can tell just from the sound that we have this good and hard. Now this hardness, it's very hard, but it is also very brittle. So now the object is to warm it up again and temper it. We'll bring it up to in the range of the low 400 degrees. But we'll judge our temperature by the color that is developed from the heat. But the first thing we have to do now is to clean off all this oxide so we get down to nice, bright, shiny metal again, so that we can see the discoloration and the oxides forming when we do the reheating. Because we will judge our temperature by color. What we're going to be using here now for the tempering process is I have this small vise which is going to hold this piece of 1/4 inch by 1 1/4 steel plate. The reason for this is if I put the torch directly on my blade to heat it up, it would heat up so quickly I wouldn't be able to control the temperature and the coloring that I want. So I lay this and hold it down on this steel plate, and this acts as a heat sink, so it'll come up much slower and I have much better control. And while I'm doing it, I will have my vice grip clamp on the shank all ready, and I'm just holding it in contact with this steel plate, playing the torch on the bottom. So as I see the color and it comes up very rapidly, I can quickly go into my quenching oil. The colors that we are going to go for is a light straw color. It goes from a very light straw to a darker straw, and then it moves down into reds, purples, and then eventually we'll get to blue. Blue we're all familiar with. That's when we are grinding and we grind too hard and we notice the end gets blue. If it should get that far, we have taken all the hardness out of the steel. We would have to reheat it, quench it, and then re-temper it again. And you can only do this a few times before you burn a lot of the carbon out of the steel. So we're looking for a straw. It'll come up very slowly, but then when it starts to move, we have to quench it immediately. The darker it gets, the softer we're going to make this until we get it back to the original softness, and that, of course, we don't want to do. Now, as I do this, I don't use as high a heat as I did before, because I don't want this to come up too quickly. The temperature we're looking for is just in the low 400 degrees. So you can imagine that this is going to come up pretty quickly. So we have to be a little careful. Might take a minute to bring it up. Good light is essential so you can see this coloring. We're probably at a couple of 100 degrees already. Okay, I can start and see a very subtle color change. We're coming very close. I'm starting to see a little darker gray. It's starting to get into the yellow. And away we go. There, I think you can see that we hit it just about right. There's that color at the end. That's what we're looking for. So I think we hit it just about right. Now we'll just polish it off and go back to the grinder to do the final grinding and then the sharpening. Now, a word of caution about this grinding. You must remember that this is high carbon steel. This is not high speed steel. So you have to keep it cool. If you have a water cooled grinder, then you would have no problem at all. But if you're using an ordinary grinder, you have to be very, very careful. If you get any discoloration at the edge, any bluing in particular, you will have to stop and start all over, do the heating to the 1500 degrees, bright red, quenching and retempering, because you have taken all of the hardness out of it. So this is probably the most difficult or trickiest part of the whole operation. A little bit of grinding into the coolant, a little bit of grinding into the coolant, and you can come up to just as you start to get a burr edge. Don't go any further, otherwise you'll change the shape. The final sharpening will be done with a hand stone, as you would a chisel or a gouge or any of your other carving tools. Remember, a light touch. Keep it cool. After each grinding, check the edge. You'll feel the edge coming up. That's the time to quit in that area. Now the handwork starts finally. This takes a little bit of time, but it's just like carving or sharpening your own carving tools, except you don't have a carving tool that's quite like this. You set it on the bevel that you have ground, and then it's a twisting motion like this to follow the curve around. You'll just have to adjust your turning as you come working around to get your edge built up. So it just takes time. I start with a coarse stone because I know I'm quite away from the edge. And I can switch to a coarser stone once, or a finer stone once I get to where I want to be. This will be easy to tell because the surface from the grinder It's totally different than the surface that you get from the sharpening stone. So you'll be able to see very clearly where you are. Now, if you recall from the segment we did on sharpening carving tools, you sharpen until you develop this burr edge. And this is nothing different than that. Just keep going until you've developed a slight burr. You wouldn't want to do that while you were grinding because it would be very hard to control, and you might change the shape of the tool rather drastically. But by doing it by hand, you can come up right up to the edge and get that burr, and you can really control it. Now you can see that we have a nice uniform grind here. So now the next step is to go to a finer stone, and we'll be pretty well finished. One thing about this is you should only have to do this very extensive grinding one time to get the grinding marks away and get the edge nicely refined. After this, it's simply a matter of resharpening, tuning it up. Now I'm going on a hard Arkansas slipstone just to get that final refined edge. A bit here. Again, each time you change stones, you'll see the different texture of the sharpened area, so you'll know if you're really doing any good or not. I think we're there. Now, just as you do with carving tools, the final step is a bit of stropping, just to get a nicely finished, refined edge. I think we have it. Now with the iron installed, you want to see that with your wedge tight, you're about 1/8 to 3/16 up from the end of the blade to start to allow the chips to come through. Now we have one more adjustment to make on the wedge itself. If it were just solid and blunt here, all the chips would pile up and just clog the throat of the plane. But we're going to cut back, as you can see on this other piece. This allows the chips to come up and then come out the side and be ejected. This can be done, it's freehand, it can be done with a knife. It's fairly straightforward. Just sketch in. It comes up about 1 1/4 inches. Just swing it on up, and this is your curve. And the rest is done with a knife. Now we have a cutback. As you can see, I have this nice sweeping curve that should eject the chips out the side. Now, setting the iron in place, set it in just by eye so that it's back from the throat. Put in your wedge, tap it in with your hammer. Not very tight, but snug. And then start by tapping it in until you think you're almost at the throat. What I do is I just slide it along. Obviously, it's not going to cut. And I'll just keep tapping until I feel it catch. There. Now I'll set the wedge, and with luck, we've hit it just about right. Oh yes. So now you have your plane. In reality, you would use a fence to guide your cut. But you see that cut that we made here is helping to eject all of our shavings and chips out the side. And then the rest is If you need more aggressive cut, which you probably don't, just a slight tap. It's not going to take much. It takes a little getting used to. There. Now we're getting a little more aggressive cut. And now you have a molding plane. The only thing that remains now is to go break all these edges so it's comfortable in your hand. You could put a little rounding here at the heel because your hand is going to fit right in here. Polish it up, take some of the dirt off that is inevitable from dirty hands while you're doing the fitting and trying. Sand it and finish it. And then you can go back to issue 11 on lettering carving and carve your name and the date on the side, and you're completely finished. And I'm Dave Reilly for Woodworking at Home.